farming centre is essentially, I set it up 2011 to be the Elm Farm Organic Research Centre of New Zealand. We're a bit smaller over here. It's basically still just myself. So I am about to throw a vast amount of information at you. But you've got the recording of this webinar. I'll give you a link to this PowerPoint in a second. So you can now put down your pads and paper that Liz just told you to pick up. What I want you to do is just actually kind of just focus and let this stuff wash over you and kind of get the big picture. And then I've got a huge amount of links to further information for the details. So you can go back and go, I really need to get my head around that. Those are the resources sitting out there for you. So that's the QR code and the short bit.ly link there. I will put this code up again at the end as well. It is only sitting in a Dropbox. It will only be around for a couple of weeks before I remove it. So don't hang around if you want to get hold of it. Another gig I have been involved with, I set up a company, Steam Weeding Limited, 15, 20 odd years ago, trying to commercialize a number of the machines I've developed over the years, particularly thermal weeders. It turns out I'm a really lousy businessman. I managed to talk about 90% of potential customers out of buying a machine because it wasn't what they needed. So there's increasingly, I'm putting stuff up for free in terms of plans, and there's a load of information on this website as well, and I'll give you the link to that at the end. So a very quick outline of where I'm going, the usual kind of content. I'll give you a bit of background on myself so you know where I'm coming from. And then I'm going to give you quite a bit of context. I think in organics, and I've been in organics for 30 odd years now, we are quite insular. And I'm working almost exclusively with mainstream conventional growers, and there is a lot of change out there now. Then we're going to start looking at what's happening in the weed management space, in particular in the failure of pesticides. So you made a good decision here. I'll touch on integrated weed management and ecological weed management. And then we get into all the machines. I'm a complete metalhead. I love my machinery, as you've just seen on the physical weeding website. We're going to have a look at the machinery for weed management. So I'm from the UK originally, did a com-hort in Riddle at the end of the 80s, kind of fell into managing a summer job at Sunnyfields Organic then, down in Southampton. Then wandered over to New Zealand on my overseas experience, did the same again at Walleda, and has basically never left New Zealand. The mid-90s, I wandered back into academia at Lincoln University, and eventually they threw me out over a decade later with a PhD. And so although I've started my career in organics, I specialize in agroecology, the sustainable ag and hort, as I've just said, mostly because I work with mainstream growers in New Zealand, partly because organics here is broke. So I'm this kind of bridge between science and farming, doing exactly this stuff. I do a huge amount of work in the extension space. This is really quite special for me because I've done, a huge amount of extension in New Zealand. I've done it in Australia and America, North and South. I've done a load in Ireland. This is the first time I've done extension in New Zealand, in the UK. So that's kind of really quite special for me. And as a scientist and academic, I'm a generalist. Non-chemical weed management, organic weed management is my speciality, but I cover everything. Soils, pests, diseases, weeds, crops, machines, whole farm systems, everything apart from livestock. Okay, our first bit of context, 9 planetary boundaries. I normally ask, have you heard of this? Doesn't work in a webinar. If you haven't heard of this, you need to get your head around this. This is really critical stuff in terms of understanding the challenges we face as a species and as a civilization. So developed about 15 years ago by some really key smart people. They said, right, what's the key ways humans are impacting the planetary systems? They identified those 9 boundaries and then determined where the boundaries were and what they are. And then they said, okay, how much have we been pushing our luck in this space? And this now is an absolutely key global measure, so this is the stuff that's banded around the likes of the UN and international policy conferences and all the rest of it. So the 9 planetary boundaries diagram here, the last boundary is only just being called of last year, the year before last now, novel entities. Most of these you'll kind of understand. Climate change at the top there is fairly self-explanatory. Biosphere integrity to you and me is biodiversity loss. Land system changes turning natural ecosystems into farmland and farmland into cities. Freshwater changes all the water we're extracting for irrigation and drinking. And biogeochemical flows, there's too much phosphorus and nitrogen in the environment. The next three unbreached are self-explanatory. Novel entities is all the synthetic stuff, all the pesticides, the plastic, and the genetic engineering stuff we are putting into the environment. Fairly obviously, the green bit in the middle is the safe operating space, the globe thing, and all the red and orange is the bad stuff. So if you're worried about climate change, I've got bad news. There's actually three boundaries that are more breached than climate change. And agriculture has a massive impact, a large part due to the fact that it occupies the largest amount of land on the planet. And weed management as well has an impact on these, including organics. We're a lot better in a lot of spaces, particularly the novel entities and the nitrogen biogeochemical flow, but we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. So when I think about weed management, this is the kind of context I'm thinking about it in. If you like the flip side to the coin of planetary boundaries as ecosystem services, this is some people are trying to rebrand this as not nature's contribution to people, to try and ram home the point exactly who these things are servicing. I like to actually cut to the chase. These are about how the biosphere keeps the humans alive. Just flicking back to the planetary boundaries, it doesn't say as a subheading, we need to save the planet. The subheading is a safe operating space for humanity. I think we make a real bad error with that statement. What this is all about is saving the humans. You know, this is really major, important, challenging stuff. So increasing ecosystem services, improving them is a key way of reducing our planetary boundaries impact. So developed about a century ago, this is the World Wildlife Fund's version. There's about 25 of these things, depending on who's divvying them up. And the reason they're critical here is farms are ecosystems. Even if they're heavily modified and simplified, they therefore still are providing ecosystem services, generally not as well as we need, hence planetary boundaries. The challenge in most places is farmers and growers are only paid for one ecosystem service, that's food, right at the top there. Europe is interesting and different. Increasingly explicitly through the CAP, Pillar 2, it's saying that we are subsidizing farmers and paying them to provide ecosystem services. This is how central the concept of ecosystem services is again. So at that kind of top scientific political level, this is also a key concept. And I'm just going to chuck on the UN SDGs, because our horticultural federation, Horticulture New Zealand, decided to put these as a policy aim in their aims and objectives for the whole of the horticultural sector for us to achieve the UN SDGs. I was just astonished, but I kind of go, well, yeah, if we're going to meet these things, it's not just government that's going to meet these things. Everybody and stuff like farming and growing has to play its role as well. So that's the kind of really big picture context, kind of bringing it in a wee bit. As I said at the beginning, I consider myself more an agroecologist rather than an organic advocate or organic scientist or whatever now, partially because I see agroecology is now clearly the top dog in what's called the sustainable agricultures or the alternative agricultures to intensive agriculture. So it's this kind of umbrella term, and organics and regenerative and etc. They're all increasingly viewed as subforms or subdisciplines within agroecology. Agroecology is also a thing in and of itself, developed about a century ago as a science observing farming, then in the 1960s starting to farm with an ecological mindset, and then in the 1980s expanding across the whole food system. So version 2 is really focused on the farm, inside the farm gate. Version 2 is the whole food system, so encompasses politics and economics and sociology and all the rest of it. And what I'm increasingly seeing is that agroecology is being posited as the replacement for intensive agriculture. Organics was set up a century ago in the 1920s to be a replacement for then industrial agriculture and then intensive agriculture. It was never meant to be some kind of marketing niche thing. It was supposed to replace mainstream agriculture. That's clearly not happened, but that's the position that agroecology is being put in now. And both the FAO and the EU are calling this for the future of the farming system. So this is the FAO. They've developed these 10 elements of agroecology to facilitate agri-food systems transformation. This is quite astonishing. You know, this is diplomatic language. Basically, what this means is they want to smash the existing food system and replace it with agroecology. And this is the FAO. They were set up in the 1950s to be the global leader of intensive agriculture and the Green Revolution. They've completely changed around. And over in the EU, as you'll be a lot more aware, you know, the agroecology, and I know there's been a few speed bumps in this kind of transition, but transitioning towards sustainable climate and ecosystem-friendly farming and food systems. And again, this little diagram, people walking away from intensive agriculture into an agroecological future. And organics is very, very clearly part of that in the EU. The last key bit of context I want to give you is the fact that there's been a complete revolution in soil health. And I jam this into basically any presentation where I can get away with it, but it is particularly of critical importance here. Somewhat surprisingly, because you kind of think of soil science as being pretty old and staid, there's been a proper old revolution, you know, toys out of cot stuff. So this is the old paradigm. Clearly stuff dies, compost gets, etc., ends up on the surface of the soil. Little organisms break it up and the microbes hook into it and decompose it, mineralize it back into inorganic compounds. The simple stuff, the sugars, the proteins, the fats, the oils, we used to think decomposed really quickly. The more complex polymers like cellulose took weeks to years, and then the really tough woody stuff like lignified material took centuries to millennia and became humus. Everybody is currently rewriting their textbooks. This is the picture of the new paradigm and the new revolution. This is based on a diagram from the paper you can see over on the left-hand side of the screen. That's not open access, but a quick Googling of the entire title, and I discovered Roots So Deep have a copy on their website that they probably don't realize is actually available to the public. So if you want to get a copy of this paper, download this PDF of this presentation and grab that link before somebody finds that paper where it shouldn't be and deletes it. So what remains of the old paradigms over there on the left? Clearly stuff does die, dead material ends up on the surface of the soil, little things break it up and the microbes hook into it. This is now called POM, particulate organic matter. And instead of being the source of all organic matter in the soil, this now only represents about 20% of organic matter in the soil. And it decomposes really quickly. In just a few years or a few decades, even the really tough woody stuff is all gone. And humus, in terms of recalcitrant organic matter resistant to further decay, simply does not exist. When we look at soil directly using new techniques, we can't find humus anywhere. And indeed, it doesn't even make sense. We start off with a big bit of dead organic matter. We break it up into smaller and smaller points down to the point of becoming inorganic again. And somewhere in this process of breaking up, poof, this great big organic humus molecule comes from somewhere. And what is it about the particular atomic arrangement of the carbon and the hydrogen and the oxygen in this thing that makes it recalcitrant, resistant to further decay? It doesn't even make sense. We're now pretty sure humus is the result, it's an artifact of the alkali extraction methods used pre-1990s. The new stuff's over here on the right. Plants are putting out through their roots between 10 to 40% of the photosynthase they make as sunlight as root exudates. And these are simple compound sugars, the fats, the lipids that we used to think decomposed really quickly. And these are feeding a vast density and diversity of microbes that live around the plant roots, and they return the favor by providing the plant with protection from pests and pathogens and water and nutrients. Different plant species produce different exudates that feed different microbes. And the bigger the plant, the more leaves and the more photosynthesizing it does, the more exudates it produces, and therefore the more microbes it feeds. And the microbes are the foundation of the soil ecosystem. So if you want to maximize soil microbes, soil organic matter formation, and soil health, we need to maximize root exudates. Hence the term in the regen circles of a diversity of living roots year round. They've been fed this new paradigm as it's being evolved, and hence that's why they're on this stuff. Also, this is what the regeners call the liquid carbon pathway, a really catchy but technically horrible phrase. So the microbes have consumed these exudates, they get turned over, they get eaten by other things. So all this organic matter, all these nutrients cycle through the soil ecosystem, and then they end up as tiny, tiny little particles of organic material inside soil mineral particles, particularly clay platelets. And this stuff is called mineral associated organic matter, which has this absolutely horrendous acronym of MAOM or MARM. Nobody actually knows how to pronounce this acronym, but we're now stuck with it. At least you won't forget it. This makes up 80% of the organic matter in the soil, and this is the stuff that now lasts centuries to millennia. This is the really important stuff. POM is far less important. And this is a hell of an eye-opener for us in organics, because we've been banging on for a century, Albert Howard and all that, about the importance of compost for soil health and the fact that soil health is founded on humus. Humus doesn't exist, and compost ends up in the POM cycle. So the regeners have this stuff right. A diversity of living roots year round drives soil ecology and drives soil health and organic matter. So I've come up with a catchphrase for this new paradigm to make it easy to remember. Humus is dead. Long live MARM. Have a think about it. It works on multiple levels. I was insufferably smug the day I came up with that. So why is this important, and what's its relevance to weed management? Well, it's important that myself and a mate who's mostly been working in the herbicide space wrote an entire book chapter on this whole issue. A lot of people say to me, okay, what's the largest negative impact of weed control on soil health? And they think it's the direct negative impact of the chemicals or the direct negative impact of cultivation. For me, it's very clear the largest negative impact on soil health from physical and chemical weed management is we are reducing plant biodiversity and biomass. I spent the first 20 years of my career perfecting mechanical weed control in organic vegetables. And I ended up in exactly the same space as all the conventional guys. Hectares of monoculture vegetables with nothing but bare soil in between them. And I now look at that and go, what a colossal disaster. It's the complete opposite of a diversity of living roots year round. It's totally the wrong thing to do. So what we need to be doing is using integrated weed management, and particularly ecological weed management. So integrated weed management is the international weed science community's plan for dealing with herbicide resistance and the loss of chemistry. We don't have a plan B. Integrated weed management basically, however, means every tool in every toolbox. The good old toolbox cliche. We always have to get the toolbox cliche out. So these are my 4 toolboxes: physics, chemistry, biology, and ecology. A lot of people just have 3 and they call the third one cultural. I still don't know what people mean by cultural. I really dislike the term. I know what biology and ecology does, and so does everybody else. So it's pretty clear. And we have ecological weed management. So it needs to be in there as a box, or a circle in this case. So this is a really key paper. Ignore the pan-European perspective bit at the end. This is the global plan for weed management going forwards. This is a really valuable paper, and it's not super technical. And what they've done is essentially try to create a framework and a structure for integrated weed management. And I'll show you my older version of this thing. If you look at some of the words in some of these boxes, rotation, cover crops up there at the top, intercropping, those are enormous topics of themselves. So it's very much a high-level framing of what's going on here. Well worthwhile going and having a look at and getting your head around. And so moving on to why we need this ecological weed management. So over a quarter of a century ago, Rod McRae and Stu Hill here, a couple of Aussies, published this little paper called the ESR concept. And if you Google it, you can go and actually find it on the web, and published in some really super obscure journal back in the 90s. Nobody ever read it, but in the last 5 years, this has suddenly been picked up again. And people are going, this is really, really helpful. And one of those people is Prof. Paolo Barberi down there on the left-hand side. He's one of the world's leading weed agroecologists. And he did a webinar and put this up. And I went, oh, I know Stu Hill. Oh, this is really good. So I stole it off him. And so Parley converted this ESR concept into weed management. So we start with conventional, basically nuking everything with herbicides. The E and ESR is for efficiency. And Parlo's calling this site-specific weed management. So you send a drone out, you map your weeds, and then spray only the areas with weeds. The S is for substitution. Parlo's calling this standard integrated weed management, so it's very chemical heavy. Also non-chemical and physical weed management. This is where we're at. A lot of the time in organic vegetable production, we are dependent on physical mechanical weed management. And all we've done is substitute physics for chemistry. You know, my hectares of monoculture of organic vegetables with bare ground. That's actually not where we need to get to. Where we need to get to is system redesign. And we talk about system redesign in organics, I think, a lot more than we actually achieve system redesign in practice. So Parlo's calling this advanced integrated weed management and ecological weed management. And I've tried to turn that into a bit more of a catchy phrase with plants versus weeds. So ecological weed management. Ecology is the science, very simply, of how organisms interact with each other in their non-living environment. And based on that incredibly simple complex, the amazingly massive and complex science of ecology is based, and that is also basically how the foundation of all our ecosystems. So very simply, ecological weed management is achieved by manipulating those conditions and relationships. And so this is my plants versus weeds, which in a very simple single word is about intercropping. So if you want to get the definitive academic guide, this is it, published 20 odd years ago. This is from the ground up, starting with a blank sheet of paper. This is absolutely comprehensive. And if you want to get the more recent free version, you can go and download this version, this book, which is also kind of more generally about weed management. So they're including physical, mechanical weeding in here as well. And this is published by SAR down at the bottom there on the cover. If you haven't come across SAR before, you're missing a lot. They have a vast amount of information on organic vegetable production in their collection. Now, I just want to kind of explain where I'm sitting at the moment, because I'm working with the mainstream stuff. Herbicide resistance is now a very massive issue. I'm walking onto conventional farms with massive herbicide resistant problems and going, if you were organic, you wouldn't have this problem. And a bunch of people kind of just stand there, look at me and nod their heads. The herbicides and the pesticides as a whole are failing. We are at the inflection point. This is really, really massive. What's also happening is many are being withdrawn from use because the scientific evidence of harms. The agrochemicals are a massive proportion of novel entities in the planetary boundaries, and the novel entities boundary is the one the most breached, and the one we think we have actually breached a lot more than we have data for. That, of course, all means the consumers, the citizens, and the politicians are seeing this and then moving politically. And basically, there's very, very little new chemicals coming to market in terms of actually completely new types, modes of actions of chemicals. There's, of course, lots of repackaging and rebranding and mixing. But to get a new product to market today costs at least $500 million US, call that euros, and 10 plus years. It's virtually impossible. This is such a massive problem globally. Western Australia is one of the kind of world leaders. Arable production in Australia is one of the world leaders in terms of herbicide resistance. They have massive tens of millions of dollar programs per year trying to bring in integrated weed management. And they've got their big six. Sounds familiar? That's where I flogged my big four heading for this thing. So a bit of reuse going on and recycling there. What's going on is not every herbicide is no longer killing anything. What's happening is there's a key pest or key weed in a really important crop, like blackgrass and wheat. They no longer have chemicals, herbicides to control that, which basically means the blackgrass becomes uncontrolled and swamps the crop in 2 or 3 years. I'm seeing crops in New Zealand. Ryegrass is our problem here. Milling wheat being turned into silage for cattle because there's so much ryegrass in it, it's unharvestable. And I've been looking at this globally, and what I've seen is it's the conventional farmers in the EU have now run out of so much herbicide road, they're back into mechanical weeding. Who's heard of Lemkin, Kverneland, Kubota, Vardestad, Monosem, John Deere? All these guys have got in, or have always been in mechanical weeding, often by buying up smaller companies. These guys expect to sell tens of thousands of units a year. So, you know, I've been nerding in mechanical weeding for 30 years, and boy, it's been a small exclusive club. Suddenly everybody's here. There's at least 80 companies I know of making weeding gear, from the biggest guys down to your kind of local regional ag machinery manufacturing companies. There is a lot of weeding gear being used out there now. It's not just in organics. So, into the exciting stuff. How can the organic weed control get? This is a farm that's been organic for 30 years. That's direct drone sown carrots. These are processing carrots, so they're sown really thinly. And as you can see, just post-emergence, this is really clean, apart from a bit of twitch cooch poking up there. A month or so on, carrots are a bit bigger. It's been mechanically weeded. And as you can see, this is exceptionally clean. There has been no hand weeding in this field. Nothing has been done in this field except from a tractor seat. I put that fat hen plant in that photo, in the center of the photo, deliberately, because the next one's 100 meters up the bed and I couldn't be bothered to walk up there to get that one in. That's the level of weed control that is possible in organic vegetables if you have your ducks in a row. So, like that kind of hexagon diagram from that integrated weed management paper, I run an organic and non-chemical weed management workshop. It's me talking at this speed for 8 hours for a day, and it's an overview. This is a massive topic when you really start getting into the details. So I developed this hierarchy over the years of the kind of key steps. And out of that, I had the big 5 that I viewed as being really important. And one of those 5 is rotations. But for weed management, rotations in a vegetable system also need to include arable crops and grazed pasture, and really intensive organic market gardening. That's just not possible. So we're down to these big 4. That's what we're going to be looking at. That's our context, our outline for the rest of the presentation. So when I started at Sunnyfields, I had this summer job. The manager then walked off after 3 years. He lost the war with weeds. Ian Nelson and Louise Nelson took the farm on. I was fresh out of Writtle. Ian was basically fresh out of Writtle because he'd finished 3 years before, but spent the last 3 years in Africa on VSA. So there's us 2 idiot greenhorns standing on this 30-acre organic vegetable farm, heaving with weeds and scratching our heads. And there's an old boy called Alan who lived on a house on the farm and who worked on the local estate the farm was part of. And he walked up to us and he said, 1 year seeding, 7 years weeding, and then wandered off scratching his ass. Probably saved our skins. Managing the weed seed rain, preventing weed seed rain getting back into the weed seed bank, back into the soil, is utterly, utterly critical. It's far easier to control weeds by stopping the weed seed rain than trying to control the weed plants that emerge from those seeds in your crops. It's absolutely critical. How big can it see? This is one of my favorite slides. Organic farmer here, arable crop of linseed, had some fat in it, not the really big tall stuff. It's all that little short stuff that germinates in autumn and puts a little fat, bunch of seeds on its head. And it didn't look bad. But he thought, oh, look, I'll just shut the combine down. He took everything off the paddock and then put it through a seed cleaning unit back in the yard. There's 10 sacks of fat hen seed there, half-ton fertilizer sacks, so 1 sack per hectare. Fat hen seed's insanely small. If that was a crop, that's probably enough to sow tens of thousands of square kilometers of farmland in fat hen, and it all would have gone back on 10 hectares had he not taken it off. So if you get it wrong, it's really easy to fill the weed seed bank up, but there's this misconception that if you have one of those kind of massive seeding events, that your grandkids are going to inherit the problem. They're not. Most seeds are lost from the weed seed bank really rapidly for a whole bunch of reasons. They're really great food, so virtually everything in the soil, from microbes to vertebrates, wants to make a meal of them. Lots of them aren't made very well, so they're not viable. So they're lost exponentially. And the correct way to think something that undergoes exponential loss is not how long that tail is when the grandkids inherit it, but its half-life. Exactly the same as radioactive decay. Radioactive decay, the tail is enormous. We don't care. What we're interested in is the half-life or the quarter life. And so for most weed seed banks, the half-life of the seed bank is just a few years, less than a handful. The long tail, particularly for the dicots with their hard seed coats, will be for decades. But when you take that 30-year-old pasture and plow it up, some of those weeds that germinate will have been sitting there for 30 years. Most of them will actually have been pooped out by birds flying over. But if those are then allowed to go to seed and their progeny allowed to seed, it's all over. 2 years of weeds going to seed, and forget it. You've lost it. This is managing the weed seed rain is becoming an increasingly important part of integrated weed management globally. And there's a really good paper here on that, and it's also open access. So if you want to kind of bury into this, there's your link. Couple of examples from the sciences. I really should put some science data up at some point. Western Australia, the guys that have had these massive problems with herbicide resistance in arable crops over there, they've developed these systems called harvest weed seed control, which has now gone global, stopping the weed seed rain of ryegrass, reduced emergence over 90% in 4 years. Who would like 90% less weeds? Stop your weed seed rain. Over in vegetables, this is by Eric Gallant, first author down there, really great bloke, been working in organic weed control in the States his entire career. He's nearly at retirement stage now. He did some work with some colleagues, stopping the weed seed rain in vegetables, reduced the weed seed bank and weed seeding densities in the following crops in the following few years between 23 to 90%, 93%. Who wants 90% less weeds? Stop the weed seed rain. However, I still see, including particularly in organics where it's just insane, weeds with seeds on them being cultivated back into the ground. We really need to have zero tolerance. Absolutely no weed seeds going back in the ground at all. And so Ian Nelson and myself, our first year at Sunnyfields, we decided to grow a shed load of lettuce because it was worth good money back in the early 90s, but also it's really quick growing. So we could get it into the ground as a transplant and harvest it before our main weeds, our fat hen, our amaranth, redroot, would go to seed. Every week we hand planted 10,000 lettuces. On one lot, it's earlier in the season, it went under some frost cloth and we forgot to check on it. And I came back after about 3 or 4 weeks and there was a whole bunch of 10 to 15 centimeter high fat hen in there, already looking like it wanted to go to seed. And I went back to the shed and I got the tractor and I put the rotavator on it and I went and cultivated it all back into the ground. I was not going to have that stuff go to seed on me. 10,000 hand-planted lettuces, a big hole in our supply. That was one of the best decisions I ever made. Never let anything go to seed and seed rain. So, how do you manage your existing weed seed bank? False and stale seed beds. I will explain what I mean by those as we go through. But these are based on 3 golden rules. The first 2, most people have a very good handle on. Most seeds are dormant in the wheat seed bank because that's how the wheat seed bank persists. But the 10% that are not dormant, if you give them the right conditions, they'll germinate really quickly. And if you want the most effective way we know, including every scientific technique to get weed seeds to germinate, is get the tractor out of the shed and go cultivating, and you get a flush of weeds. What is less commonly known is that flush of weeds will have originated from seeds that are all in the top inch of the soil, no deeper. Let's have a look at that. So if you're kind of going, this looks kind of vaguely familiar, that's because it's in Organic Farming by Nick Lampkin and he stole it off Roberts. So lots of recycled information here. So what we have is along the bottom axis is a measure of seed size, in this case weight. It's a log scale, but that's actually not important. And on the left-hand axis, we have the maximum depth of emergence, and then a range of weed seeds with increasing seed weights going from juncus, which is rushes, stellaria media is chickweed, and then it's wild oats down there at the bottom right. And then very clearly a tight fit of a line. That telling us that tight fit tells us this is a physical relationship. A weed seed is a finite package of energy and nutrients, and it can only power a seedling up to grow up through so much soil before it exhausts itself and dies. So the bigger the seed, the deeper it can emerge from. But this is also the maximum depth of emergence. Only 1% of seeds of that species can emerge, or that size can emerge from that depth. And it's not a linear relationship. So that means more than 50% of the seedlings will have emerged from half that depth, 2 and a bit centimeters an inch. That's where all the trouble's coming from. So stale and false seed beds, it's about growing the weeds, killing them, and then growing your crop. So false seed bed uses cultivation, and stale seed bed is flame weeding, although flame weeding is a tool, not the technique, if you like. Caveat on all of this: if you've got a rubbly dry seed bed, nothing germinates. You know, you have to have a good quality moist seed bed to maximize weed seed emergence. So here's my principle of a false seed bed again, flogged off Nick Lampkin. We start by cultivating the ground up, then the non-dormant weed seeds in the top inch of the soil start to germinate and emerge, and then we come through with some further cultivation and kill them off. This is your critical control point. You have to get this recultivation absolutely correct, or you're wasting your time. Then we've depleted the emergible weed seed bank in the top inch. We've got a nice clean piece of ground, and we can sow our crop or plant our crop into it. Now, stale seed beds start off the same way. I'll just flick backwards and forwards here. Cultivate the ground, get the weeds emerging. Then we are sowing crops into this, and we're sowing them into the emerging weeds. And just 12 to 24 hours before the crop emerges, we kill the weeds off with a flame weeder. And then we've got crop in nice clean ground, no soil disturbance, and no further impetus for weeds to germinate. So typically these terms are used interchangeably. I needed something to differentiate them, so I've kind of repurposed them. False seed bed and a stale seed bed there. You can see what the definitions are yourselves. For me, false seed beds are the humdinger technique here. Indeed, I got contacted a few years back by a professor from an American land-grant university with an organic vegetable farm, and they'd been struggling to control weeds. And he said, I found your paper on false and stale seed beds, which I'll show you in a minute. And he said, that has changed our game entirely. We are now on top of the weeds. False seed beds are so good and so cheap if you have the right gear. You'd use them for pasture establishment, and I have. When we're using flame weeding is expensive, slow. We're only going to be using those for high-value direct-seeded crops. So we need some machinery for doing this recultivation. There's these 2 parameters. We must have the most shallow cultivation possible. And if we go deeper than 5 centimeters, we haven't created a false seed bed. We've created a new seed bed, and we're back to square one. And we want really every weed to be dead. There's very little gear that can actually achieve this. First is the springtime weeder. This is an amazingly valuable weeding tool, even in vegetables, you know, not in salads, but leeks and cabbages and a whole load of other stuff, especially when everything's bigger. And Treffer have got a hand pull one for the really small scale stuff. You know, so one of these is immensely valuable tools. We were lucky at Sunnyfields. The first manager was given a lot of money to spend and bought a lot of gear, including what I call a milling machine bed former that you can see here. Really great for false seed beds. Make your first bed, go deep, and then you get your weed flush, come back through, lengthen the top length. The front rotors barely hit the ground. The back crumbler roller is in the ground, wipes out all the weeds. The problem, of course, this is a large, expensive and slow piece of equipment. So I started developing my own machinery, and this is what I call a roller undercutter bar, very unimaginatively. It's a false seedbed cultivator, to give it a technical name. Basically, it's a smooth roller, acting as a depth wheel, also making a really nice seedbed, and connected to 2 very lightweight, thin undercutter bars. Think of them more like a giant hoe blade, if you like, for planing through the soil. One on the front and one on the back. And this is Clearly simple, lightweight, can be used at speed, 10 kilometers an hour, flies down the bed and basically just slices through those little weeds. Having the rear bar also gives you options in terms of leaving the soil loose for maintaining moisture, or for bigger weeds going faster, flick them up into the air and they come down and desiccate on the soil surface. This crew, Fix Engineering in Australia, got some really smart ideas and built some gear to give them their dues. They also came up with this idea. The issue with a horizontal bar, of course, is it picks up all the residue, so it only works on short runs. They put a reciprocating device on their horizontal bar, but also a crumbler roller. They're going far too deep. It needs to be a lot more shallow than this. And so to deal with that issue of residues, and also for stony soils on larger areas, this is the machine I developed. This is actually parked at Sunnyfields in this photo here. Essentially got some A-blade hose off interow hoe, put them really close together, 2 rollers, and off we went. I would redesign this now to be a lot more compact, but very, very effective, because very, very precise depth control. So this is an amazing machine. And the third way I developed to doing this is the rod weeder, or the dust mulcher as it's called, from the American Midwest. Basically integrated into a springtime cultivator, swap the crumble roller for a smooth roller, and it's hydraulically powered contrary to the direction of flow. 6.5 meters wide. We've actually worn this out several times and had to replace the bar. It's been used so much. This is what's being used for establishing pasture. You don't even have to have it as part of a cultivator. You can just have a smooth roller with the rod weeder on it. So for stale seed beds, the design parameters, we must have no soil disturbance, because the crop is literally at the soil surface, and we're talking about high value, uncompetitive crops like onions and carrots. So we want absolutely all the weeds killed with a large safety margin. So herbicides would be ideal. I mean, we have organic herbicides, the fatty acids, they're not very good. They're really expensive. There is vinegar. It's horrible. Yeah, if you want to use it, be my guest. For me, the non-chemical approach here is thermal weeding. Every conceivable method of thermal weeding, except for ionizing radiation, has been tried, including cold stuff. The only stuff that is viable is flame, steam, and electrical weeders. In vegetable production, flame weeders are basically your main option. There's more available. They're the cheapest to buy. Your main issue is fire risk, so don't stick them in the hedge. Just use them on the cultivated ground. Steam weeders, I've done a huge amount of steam weeders. I'll give you an example in a minute. On a kilowatt basis, with a well-designed hood on a flame weeder, steam weeders are no more effective on a kilowatt basis. There's no fire risk, which is good. So if you have a major fire risk, maybe steam is your thing. But you're almost certainly, for vegetable production, going to have to build your own. They're more complex and they cost you more. On the electrical weeding front, there's only one machine. That's from Zasso, suitable for seed beds. I haven't seen it being used for stale seed beds. The price is absolutely insane compared to a flame weeder. But in the bigger picture, electrical weeding is massively more energy efficient than flame and steam. It is even more energy efficient than herbicides. So here's your archetypal flame weeder. It's green, it's a Hoff. It's basically, in my view, a giant upside down barbecue. It's a massive big tunnel into which a whole load of hot air is thrown, not very effectively. And of course, it uses an awful lot of energy. That's a 1-ton propane tank on the front of this guy. So starting at Sunnyfields with an aromatic barter that Nigel left us, I've been working on how to optimize the design of naturally aspirated flame weeders. So on and off through different farms, I've steadily improved the design, and this is it. As far as I'm concerned, this is the problem solved. This is what the ultimate naturally aspirated flame weeder looks like. So we'll have a look at the working principles here. I will actually just jump onto this next slide where we've got a row flamer. So you can see at the front here, hopefully you can see my arrow, my mouse cursor. This is our down tube, the hot part here, and then the chimney. All right, excuse me, going back. So here in Canterbury, we can be in the middle of summer, a 30-degree day, and we can have an 80-kilometre-an-hour wind howling across our fields. So I also had to design a flamer that's going to be windproof. So the principle here is you want to have as low a shield or hood as possible because hot air rises. You want to keep that heat as close to the ground as possible, so there's just enough space for the hot gases to actually move through the flamer. That means you can't put the flame in at the front, you have to put it in the roof. So I developed this down tube system with a horizontal opening, which means the wind can't blow in here. The cold air just gets sucked in. Then the burner doesn't so much push the flames through the flamer, it puts the heat on the ground and the flamer hood moves over the top of that hot spot. And then to keep the wind and the cold air out, because a lot of these burners allow a whole load of cold air to go in. I'm kind of going, why do you want to put cold air under your flamer hood? I've got these baffles, 2 baffles front and back. I call them cat flats. And so as the air can't get out the back of the machine, it's got to go out the top. So what do? You put a chimney on it. The day I realized we need to put chimneys on flames was a real hallelujah. Again, vertical exit so the wind can't get in there. How's that? Only took me 20 years. Genius. And here again, that's what the kind of operating principle looks like, a bit more easily seen. These are so efficient, you can put your arm down that chimney at the back when this is operating at the correct forward speed and it's just pleasantly warm. You won't get burned. Here's a pedestrian machine I had designed for a bloke here in New Zealand. We're looking at the back end, so that's the chimney in front of you. He's really sheltered, so he didn't think he needed a down tube, but we're just using off-the-shelf burners. So this is all machinery. I've designed all my machinery so it can be basically built by anybody with average workshop skills and off-the-shelf materials. Of course, really small areas, we've got handheld burners. A word from some experience I had. Say this is 30 kilowatts, that's consuming oxygen at the same rate as 40 people. If you're in an enclosed space, it's really easy to asphyxiate yourself with a handheld flame weeder or a tractor flame weeder in a glass house. Make sure the doors and windows are open, please. So this is the Zasso machine I think we could use for stale seed beds. I've never seen anybody using it for that. But the challenge is here, the cost, this is 50 to 100,000 euros. This is just bonkers numbers at the moment. This is probably costing more than some of your farms. And this is I built a number of these, what I call direct fired steam weeders. So a non-pressurized boiler. This is 6.5 meters wide. This has a heat output of 1.2 megawatts, 1,200 watts. The tractor is 100 kilowatts. The steamer is 12 times higher energy output than the tractor. It's all a bit mad, but a lot of fun. There's your book. You can go download and have a report you can go over and have a look at later. I will quickly throw a tidbit in here. We're really pushing on because I'm watching the clock here. We've got a bunch of crops that are resistant to flame weeding due to their morphology, and a bunch of our weeds, especially the sticky up stuff like fat hen, is highly susceptible. This can be a big get out of jail card and a regular selective thermal weeding technique. This is a 10-hectare crop of carrots and onions, 5 hectares of each. There's the onions. Most people will consider this a disaster, especially with 10 hectares of it. Post-emergent flame weeding, and the onions come back with a bit of clover and nightshade. Well, we just hoed that out. You can also use these for your cut and come again crops, stuff like parsley and chives. Harvest a bed, flame it, get rid of all the residue, the disease, all the little bad leaves you don't want growing back again. You get a beautiful clean crop coming back. There's also what I call intrarow thermal weeding. This is bigger crop plants and weeding around the base of those crop plants. This is what Americans consider to be flame weeding. We've got very different ideas of flame weeding in Europe and the States. This again can be a major get out of jail card, on crops like sweet corn, at those, when they've got about 10 centimeters high. Okay, row hose. I'll explain what this term row hoe as we go through here. So the old Super Prefer from Monosem, a Nicholson or a Webb down on the left-hand side there in orange. Good old Fobro brush hoe up there. I've spent many hours on that thing. And the original budding basket weeder down in the bottom, and the tool carriers. So we've had a whole load of different gear over the years for weeding in our crops, all different designs and machines. But I've been watching what's been happening in the evolution and the change in the marketplace and the sudden explosion of all the big machinery companies getting in there. And so I wrote a report on it. There's 80 odd pages in that one, I think. So we've had all these different approaches in the year. I've seen more in the last 10 plus years is that everybody now has converged on the same machine design, what is called a modular parallelogram type. So all the farmers using these things and all the manufacturers have basically kind of mutually agreed that this is the way to go. And I'm calling these the Swiss Army knife of weeders. So the key improvements in the last 20 years, these are them for me. So let's go and have a look at each of these. So what we have with these older weeders, the Nicholson Webb machine here, the weeding tools are built into the machine itself. So apart from changing the crop gap, actually changing anything else is quite a large piece of work. What the modular parallelogram unit machines are is essentially a platform onto which weeding tools are mounted. So that means the same fundamental piece of machinery can be used to set up to weed any crop, from narrow row cereals to big row maize, everything from salad onions up to cauliflowers, by changing the weeding tools to match the crop, the spacing, the weeds, the weed size, the soil, all the rest of it. So hence the Swiss Army knife metaphor. Quick terminology check. If you're kind of struggling, we all know the interow. I use the term the intrarow a lot, and that's essentially just the crop row. If we're looking at a machine, that's essentially the crop gap. I split up intrarow weeders into two types. I have a hierarchy of weeders or a system for defining them that's in that report. And so the discriminatory stuff use some kind of sensor and then weed around the weeds, a bit like the Garford natty little rotating weeder. I'm not going to cover them, and I also think they're a waste of time in most situations. The non-discriminatory one weed the crop and the weeds alike. Now, particularly recently, if I had £1 for every time in the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s, somebody had said for every time somebody did say to me, wouldn't it be great if we had a robot with lasers on it that could kill weeds? We have them now. And I don't think that they're astonishing technology, don't get me wrong. But in terms of really killing lots of weeds really effectively and for not very much money, I think they're completely rubbish. A good row hoe with both interrow and intrarow weeding tools can kick their butts. The most important weed in a field is the one growing next to the crop plant, not the one 6 inches away. These are the close to crop plant weeds. Most discriminatory weeders can't get near them because if they did, they'd kill the crop plant. So a good row hoe with intrarow weeding tools on it can achieve superior weed control at much lower capital cost because the robots are bonkers expensive. And a row hoe can do 5, 10, 15, 20 kilometers, a bit less miles an hour, down a paddock. The robots can work at walking pace at the very best. And the row hoes now hit 30 meters wide. It's absolutely insane. So don't dream of robots, dream of a really good row hoe. So the intrarow weeders, we called these things interrow hoes because that's what they did. They hoed the interrow and left the intrarow unweeded. And we then sent out, and you may still be doing this, going out and weeding by hand the intrarow. A tough row to hoe wasn't a metaphor originally, it was a statement of fact. With these intrarow weeders on our row hoes, we can now really effectively weed the intrarow as well. And there's 5 main tools for doing this. So let's go and look at those quickly. Finger weeders, I'm assuming most of you have seen these or got some idea of them. What I'm seeing is every manufacturer of row hoe is offering these to go to put onto their machine. So these are really, really highly considered very highly now. What's much less known is what I call mini ridges. When I was at Southampton, the bottom photo there is of the Sunnyfields brush hoe. When I was first on the farm, I kind of did my initial 2 years, then came back after my master's. I noticed the ridging effect we were getting off the tunnels, and other people have commented on this at all, and I thought that's really great. I thought we need to make more use of that, but I basically wasted a decade or so trying to use essentially cultivator points, duck's foot type points to make a ridge. It's totally the wrong thing to do. The right thing it turns out to do is to weld 2 pieces of mild flat steel bar at a right angle and pop them on a leg. The height of the horizontal bar determines the height of the ridge, so you can make a very precise height ridge by having different height bars. I've put a 1 centimeter high ridge under 5-leaf carrot plants, direct sown, of course. The one in the top left-hand corner there, I don't like the way it's on an A-blade hoe. That's I've forgotten the name now of the company. Anyway, here's your typical situation in vegetables. We've got some transplanted crops. 2 or 3 weeks after transplanting, got a nice flush of vegetables. We've come through with a brush hoe and the mini ridges on the back, and we have 100% weed control, including coastal crop plant weeds. At Sunny Fields, when we just had the brush hoe, we had a gang of 10 Eastern Europeans back in the 90s going through after the brush hoe and manually hand weeding the intrarow. They then, after I developed the mini ridges, they were all redundant for hoeing, so they all went off to other jobs. 15 years after developing this on farm, seeing it work exceptionally well, and telling a whole load of other people, I finally did the science on it. So what we did is we grew a whole bunch of different plant species as surrogate weeds to some different sizes, up to 13 centimeters tall, and then carefully buried them to simulate how a mini ridger works, and discovered species and height has no effect. The black dotted line is the average of everything. Burial depth down the bottom, 0 means the topmost leaf of the plant is just level with the top of the soil. -1 means there's 1 centimeter of crop sticking up above the row. -2, 2 centimeters. And then the positive integer, excuse me, that's the depth of soil above the plant. So if you look at the black dotted line, if you've got 2 centimeters or more of crop sticking up above the ridge, you get 100% survival. If you've got 1 centimeter or more of soil over the weeds, you get almost 100% weed kill. Absolutely genius. 3 centimeter height difference between crop and weeds, mini ridges, and you can get almost 100% intrarow weed control. Desperately underappreciated technique. There's an entire report dedicated to just mini ridges there. Bigger ridges, you need discs or ridger things, whatever they call. Torsion weeders. I hated the original ones that came out of the States. They've been vastly improved now. I think these are also a really valuable intra-row tool. And then we have the rotating spring wire weeders. Yes, the one on the right, Steteki, is just a bunch of hay bob tines on a wheel. Einbox era style rotation, they're taken out of their big field weeder and put onto a row hoe. Really good with sticky up plants like maize and onions and leeks and things like that. Pretty aggressive. I wouldn't be using them in salads. So if you're kind of going, that's all very good, but which of these intra-row weeders do I get? My answer is all of them. Most of them are actually not that expensive, and they've got these different modes of action so we can stack them. You know, put a ridge up with a mini ridger, kill a load of weeds. When you get a flush of weeds on that, come through with a wire weeder and knock that down and kill those weeds, and then come back through later on again and put a bigger ridge up. Or run a torsion weeder before a finger weeder. You know, every intra-row weed you can control with a piece of machinery with a row hoe is a weed you don't have to weed by hand. It's worth spending time and money getting this optimized to avoid hand weeding. So hence the change in name. These things are no longer intra-row hoes because they don't just hoe the intra-row. So simplest thing, just call them a row hoe. Then we come to the guidance systems. These kind of 3 options you see here will be familiar. This is mainly applicable to the bigger scales of production, you know, where we've got machines that are, you know, 6 meters plus wide. What I've seen over the 20 years from these 2 systems, everybody's now using camera systems. It's clearly one out of using GPS for steering the hoe and the drill. This stuff's clearly still expensive for small operations. Even the cheapest, you know, tractor auto steers, you know, 10,000 quid. The specialist row hoe manufacturers are still providing machines with a seat on the back and a steering wheel. But particularly for the small scale stuff, I have this concept of a local positioning system, LPS, kind of version of the controlled traffic farming. Compaction is our biggest enemy in terms of soil management. So I've put markers on farms in the fence line or along the hedge every 5 to 10 beds so I can keep my beds in exactly the same place. Even if we go into a pasture phase, I can put the beds back and it's just a bunch of wood and paint. So with 30 years experience, if I was starting as a novice organic vegetable grower, what would I do? I would buy a 3-point linkage modular parallelogram row with every weeding intrarow weeding tool I can possibly afford. If I'm bigger scale, I'd get a larger tool carrier that can carry the modular parallelogram units. I would never use a fixed height toolbar again. Or if you need a wheel hoe, I can help with that. When I was in Ireland, I was working with really small scale acre or two size organic vegetable growers. Previously, I've been in New Zealand driving tractors with 6-meter wide interow hoes doing 10Ks down the paddock. And I'm trying to go, why does everybody trying to look like make themselves build up to Arnold Schwarzenegger here with all these pushing these wheel hoes backwards and forwards? Why aren't you just pushing the things straight down your crop row like I was doing with the big tractor mounted thing? You know, I wasn't going backwards and forwards on my tractor. I spent a year of my own time after work developing this. The 4-wheel hoe. This is the Mark 8. This is the most complex piece of machinery I've ever designed. It took a whole year, various prototypes, all the rest of it. It is the Swiss Army knife of push hoes. So it's got both T-hoes and mini ridges on it. So this will give you 100% weed control. So if you're kind of at that scale, this is what you need. And you can download the plans for free via physical weeding. I'm just going to touch on electrical weeding once more, because this is massively important in my view, particularly as a replacement for glyphosate in conventional production. But what it can do is truly quite amazing. So there's a report on it, another 80 pages. So if you want to understand electrical weeding, there's everything you possibly might want to know. So that's a lot of information and links to vastly further amounts, even greater amounts of information. Those are my 3 main websites where that information is sitting. And if you're kind of going, I really, really want to build a flame weeder or a steam weeder or whatever, flick us an email. So thank you very much. Any questions? Time for questions now, and happy weeding. And there's your link to the presentation. Thank you very much indeed.
Whoo, take a breather. Thank you so much, Merf. That was a lot.
Let me...
Oh.
Right, questions. Chat. Where's Q&A?
We haven't actually. I think
no open questions. I did see a hand go up earlier. Probably too busy listening.
Yeah, too busy writing notes and digesting. I know that I took about 4 pages of notes. My fingers were flying off the keyboard. So I'm definitely going to have to go and revisit that.
Yeah, key thing here, this is being recorded, so you can go back, even in slow motion, and listen again. And of course, all the links through to stuff.
I will definitely be doing that.
What about when it rains all summer? Yeah, in terms of mechanical weeding, that's where the brush hose are doozer. Let me get rid of these pictures because I always tend to end up looking at the pictures view. Gallery, hide self view. Yeah, look, the brush hoe is an amazing implement in wet conditions. It's one of my favorite anecdotes at Sunnyfields. We were well behind with the weeding. We had fat end that was, 4 or 5 inches high. We're on grade 3 stony soils with heavy clay. There's a huge amount of rains forecast, so we got the brush hoe out and went for it. And we kept weeding through the first inch of rain. And basically, we stopped weeding when the tractor started falling off the wheelings. So the brush hoe is really critical there. The different weeding tools work at varying levels in the rain. The mini ridger in particular is a doozer because most of our weeding tools benefit from hot, dry conditions to kill the weeds. The mini ridger works by excluding sunlight. So as long as the soil's not so wet that it's impossible to form a ridge, the mini ridger will still kill weeds. It's really quite a profound tool. To me, it's you have to have mini ridgers. They're so simple to be. If you can weld and cut steel, you can build mini ridgers. So that's an answer there. And then, various different other weeding tools will cope with wet soil conditions better than others. Timing. Okay, next question. Tools are great, but I struggle sometimes. Should we weed on a schedule weed when we have a flush of weeds? You always weed at cotyledon stage. The bigger weeds get, the harder they are. So it's actually really simple. As soon as you see a flush of weeds and you think that flush has fully come through, go to it. Do not wait till they get bigger. The Americans also have this concept of the white thread stage. It's never been clearly defined, but I often take it to be when a weed has germinated, but before it's broken the surface. A lot of people think that's a good time to weed. I don't think weeding before the weeds have emerged is good, because if you bury a weed before it's emerged with more soil, it can still grow up through that soil. It's once they've emerged and put out their cotyledons, they can, and you put more soil on them, they can't grow up through that. You know, that burial stuff, we have 13 centimeter high plants. We put 1 centimeter of soil over the top of them and we killed them. It's an astonishingly powerful technique. Okay, next question. Does the false seed bed machine have a leveling bar before the back roller? Is it fixed or swinging under gravity? No, what we've done for the false seed beds, you want a really nice quality bed that's already nice and level, because if you are hoeing, if your bed's all over the place, your hoe is, you know, even a good parallelogram hoe is going to struggle to follow the contour. So your beds want to be nice and firm and flat to start with. And then it's the bars on the roller, undercutter bars, with just literally undercutter bars, piece of spring steel with a sharpened front edge, you know, and 10 mils thick, if that. Might have even been 8. But they are fixed. They're not, you know, they're not swinging or anything. Right, next question. Mini ridges. What size mini ridges do you suggest we start with? I have a complete set. We start at 1 centimeter high, then go to 15, then I got a 20, then it's about, I'll probably have a 30 and then possibly a 40, and we go up to 10. Much higher than 10 really doesn't make much sense. And it's literally pieces of mild steel flat bar. It's the cheapest steel you can buy, and just welded on a right angle. We do change the angles a bit narrow when we've got really high speed machines. So if we're using them on tractors with camera guidance systems and we're doing 15K, we make them narrower, otherwise the side throw of the soil's too much. The width is basically the narrower, the lower the height of the mini ridge bar, the longer the bars need to be in terms of the interow area, because if you're only making a small ridge, it's only a small width. As you get up to making really big ridges, you know, say 10 centimeters high, the weeder face actually needs to be further away. And so a bit of it's just playing around. You know, it's steel. It's easier to cut stuff off steel than glue stuff on with a hot welder. So, you know, just make one, try it by hand even, work out what's the right size. But the smallest I've done with carrots is literally, you know, about 5 true leaves. The carrots are only about 5 centimeters high. And we can put a centimeter under the bottom of those easily. Best tools for flinty, stony loam. Pretty much anything. It's surprising. I've used intrarow hoes on some very, very stony soils here in New Zealand. You know, probably 50% stones. It's a very hard sandstone, so it's not a flinty kind of one, which is really highly abrasive. But it's surprising with those parallelogram hoes, with a good set of tools on them, most things will go through, even quite stony soils. Your challenge is, of course, if you've got really small vegetables, especially direct sown, of moving stones around, but surprisingly, pretty much anything. The brush hoe, again, is also really good for that, you know, that we used at Sunnyfields on our really stony soil there. But yeah, pretty much everything. Anonymous attendee down the bottom. You spoke about how important it is to have living roots in the soil, or you're around a disastrous growing vegetables surrounded by bare soil. But yeah, then only spoke about all the mechanical stuff. Yeah. Do you have any recommendations for integrated weed management that incorporates methods such as no-dig, minimum tillage, and roots in the ground year-round? Yes, I mean, so what we're getting into here is intercropping. The no-dig, minimum tillage is kind of a separate issue. But what we're looking at in intercropping, intercropping is growing 2 or more plants together as a mixture. And there was a great phrase I picked up recently: intercropping is like a marriage. Some work, some don't. So the challenge with an intercrop is finding the right plants to grow together. The first thing I do to split these out is go, well, are we going to grow 2 or more cash crops together? Or are we going to grow cash and a service crop? So what we call a cover crop. Increasingly, these things are getting called service crops because cover crops kind of a different thing. So your classic example of a service crop and a cash crop would be growing sweet corn and then having a clover service crop growing underneath it. The challenge here is immense, and this is partly the reason I haven't done it. We've got 3/4 of a century experience of using modern mechanical weeding gear, so we've really, got this stuff now very, very good. In terms of integrated weed management through intercropping, we just don't have the on-farm experience. We have much less research, and this is also really site specific. Your soil type, the crops, your climate can all impact whether an intercrop is going to work or not. So if I develop, to use the chemical example, somebody develops a herbicide. If you use it as per the instruction, it works anywhere in the world. Ditto a mechanical weeder. If it's set up correctly for your crop and soil type and stuff, it'll work anywhere in the world. An intercrop that works really well in the south of England mightn't work at all in Scotland. It's a massive, massive problem. And also how you do the intercropping, the maize and the clover example, often what we call a living mulch, we'll call the clover a living mulch. The spatial integration, in arable cropping, where the guys are mixing, stuff like wheat and beans or peas, and actually just sowing them as random mixtures. Then you're kind of growing stuff in alternating rows, all the way up to the work they've been doing at Wageningen in the Netherlands around what they're calling strip cropping, where they're growing essentially bed width or multiple bed widths worth of a single crop, and then other stuff next door it, and finding there's intercropping benefits even at that scale. So the challenge here is simply there's so much rope, it's very easy to hang yourself with. And it's kind of the thing, we can't do a piece of research and say, this is really great, use it on your farm, because your farm's different and it may not work there. So this is literally stuff you have to go and try yourself. That's a very long answer to that question. Let's go. Right, Beth method for controlling deep rooting weeds, thistles. Well, entirely depends on the roots. So one of the things I have in my weed workshop is this thing I call the bud-based perspective. If we want to kill a plant, we have to either kill all the buds above ground or below ground, or we have to separate the thing of the hypocotyl, the junction between the foliage and the root system. So just because something's deep rooting doesn't mean it's the same in terms of this bud-based perspective. And my favorite example is dock and dandelion in this space. So in dandelion, the root going down is true root, and part of the thing we need to separate out here is plants are really annoying because some of them put foliage underground. A potato tuber is actually a stem, so it shouldn't really be under the ground. And then some plants put their roots in the air. Putting their stems underground is the more common approach. So the tap root on a dandelion is true root, and it is fully capable of dedifferentiation. So generally, when a plant starts growing, the shoots, the meristems, the buds on those shoots can only produce more shoots and leaves and flowers. They can't suddenly start producing roots. If they do suddenly start producing roots, that's the process of dedifferentiation. Excuse me. This is, of course, also what underpins our standard, 2-node cuttings. Take a 2-node cutting, dip it in the rooting, bottom 2 foliar nodes in the rooting powder, stick it in a bench and some soil, and those nodes differentiate at the bottom and start producing roots. Dandelion root can dedifferentiate. You can cut it up into really small parts and it will produce a shoot from it. Dock is the thing I spent 2 years working on in Ireland. The top of the underground organs in a dock is stem. It's a crown. Dock is morphologically identical to rhubarb. So that crown is a short vertical compressed underground stem. It can regenerate both shoots and roots like nuts. Just like rhubarb, dock also has the taproot going down. It's that big rubbery taproot. It's actually got very few side roots on it, just like a rhubarb root. If you pull up a rhubarb root, there's basically no soil clinging to it. It's entirely imperinating and a storage organ. The true root of dock cannot dedifferentiate. Your main challenge here in this, and I'm kind of reading into this, it's Californian or creeping thistle. You know, it's one of the world's worst weeds. It's difficult to kill even with herbicides. It's the part of Californian thistle that you need to target is that underground root system, which is the creeping root system. It's the organ of perennation, and it's also its storage organ. And my favorite tool for doing that, and I've got an entire paper on it on the Future Farming website, Crushing Californian Thistles to Depth, is basically wait until autumn when you have the correct soil conditions for subsoiling, or at least cultivating very deep, get in and smash up that root system. Californian thistle is deciduous. There's no foliage over winter. It goes dormant over winter. You're then smashing up that root system just before winter. So it's going into winter with a really bad headache. And then typically they will still get plants coming up. So for me, the best thing to do is to grow a smother crop. So that's a service crop that's highly smothering, and rye corn and vetch, common or hairy, depending whether it's summer or winter, your key choice. So once you've smashed up your Californian thistle with your subsoiler, you then grow an overwinter cover crop, so that when the smother crop, so come spring, that smother crop takes off, the thistles come up above ground and they're in the dark. And if you leave that for summer, you'll probably wipe out your thistles, your Californian thistles. Next one, bindweed and couch, completely different beasts. Couch has got a surface shallow rhizome. So that's your shallow cultivation, trying to bring it up. But again, the ecological weed management for that, outcompete it. It's putting in a really hulking big smother crop. So again, that kind of 1-2 combo of some cultivation to break it up, give it a headache, put a big old smother crop in it and kind of walk away. Again, I mean, your problem there with all these smother crops and service crops is they're all taking land out of production. Bindweed is a complete nightmare because it's got an underground creeping stem that will go really, really deep. And so cultivation is not really helping here. Californian thistle, the roots tend to be in a layer, bindweeds everywhere. It's basically you have to exhaust it through stopping it photosynthesizing. If you're in a more extensive farming system, sheep really love bindweed. I've seen places in the States where they get it in perennial cane fruits and stuff like that. They basically give up for a year, put sheep into the paddock, and they eat the bindweed to death. Gallant soldier, that's interesting. I mean, that's an annual. So the question is, how best to manage gallant soldier with direct seeded carrots and beet? Kind of interesting why you've got so much of that. That's not a common weed. That's really quite interesting. It's the big four. It's never let it go to seed. If you've got direct sown stuff, the flame weeding is your friend. And one of the things I didn't describe a part of that is multiple flame weeding. So weed growing here in Canterbury, organic onions, and we are direct sowing them. And we have just got enough time between spring and autumn to direct sow these things, get them out, field dry them, and get them into a shed. So we're slightly, kind of more amenable conditions than you guys. What we'll do with our onions is, we pick the cleanest piece of ground to start with that we can, and that's hopefully got, lots of good soil health and nitrogen. We will cultivate the seed beds as early as possible. We may do 1 or 2 false seed beds with the roller undercutter bar. We will then do a stale seed bed, or possibly even use the flamer twice, do a flaming basically before we sow the onions, and then a flame just before the onions come up. And then once the onions have got 2 true leaves on them, we will flame them again, post-emergent flame weeding, and we will do that even twice. So both carrots and beets become resistant. They are highly susceptible to flame weeding when they're small because they've still got their cotyledon up above ground. But once they form that rosette and they pulled themselves into the ground a bit, they become a lot more tolerant. So you can go over the top of those maybe say 5 true leaves for both of them. Flame them off. You will take all the foliage off, but you will kill the gallant soldier because it's got its hypercotyl far enough above ground will do it a lot of damage. The answer to when is the right timing is you have to try this stuff yourself. And again, one of my favorite phrases, do not bet the farm on this stuff. So you kind of go, right, we're going to start playing with pre and post emergent flame weeding in seeded carrots and beet. Get a hand flame weeder and just do a few meters to start with. You know, so literally when the crop comes out the ground, flame that, see if you can kill it. And keep trying on different crop stages and different weeds as well, and seeing what stages you can kill the weeds at and how much heat's required and what the crop can stand. And basically you just have to learn yourself. Okay, mare's tail. So I'm assuming that, oh, the questions are really piling in here. Equisetum. So I'm assuming you're talking about the non-flowering plant here. That is a complete nightmare because it has astonishingly deep underground rhizome and stem systems, and it's basically you have to just exhaust it. So, you know, in some situations really intensive, you might actually put the old black plastic sheet down and walk away for a couple of years. You know, again, that's going to do nothing for your soil health. That's definitely not living roots year round. So the ecological weed management approach will be very much, okay, we're just going to grow a massive smother crop here that's going to do it. It's typically a bunch of annuals, so at some point you'll cut it all down, possibly mulch it and replant a smother crop, and it's kind of almost keep going. I mean, with herbicides, it's almost impossible to kill with herbicides. What I have seen, just came to mind, some guys who are trying an electrical weeder in the United States decided while they had the thing on the tractor, they would run it over some mare's tail, and it gave it a really nasty headache. It hated it. So possibly getting the root wave handheld weeder, if you know somebody who's got one and you can borrow, because they are really expensive pieces of kit. I think they're £50,000. But if you can borrow one, give it a go. You may be surprised how far down into the system it nails the foliage. You will have to multiple retreat it, but it may be an option. I'd love to know how that comes out. What's your ideal vegetable rotation? I've got another great phrase. Where's the best place to grow organic vegetables? It's on an organic livestock farm. Because the problem with growing vegetables on vegetables, of course, all the vegetable pest diseases and particularly weeds come up. So for me, the best rotation overall is your old school classic mixed farming rotation. You have, you know, a few years of cropping, including some vegetables, including some arable crops, and then you have 2 or 3 years of pasture with livestock on it. The challenge is, of course, in intensive vegetables, the economics just don't stack up for being able to do that stuff and at a practical level, because the sheep, of course, escape and eat your lettuces. For me, the cover cropping, there's an interesting comment from a regenerative farmer here who's also into his minimum tillage. And he was doing everything right on, you know, he's got his residues and all this kind of stuff. Things were still not firing. Then these guys started getting into really short duration cover crops. So that start harvesting. So we're starting harvesting now. So they might harvest something in January. They're going to replant an autumn crop in, say, March, and normally they'd just leave it fallow. He and his mates started putting really short-term cover crops in, so really quick growing stuff, your buckwheats, your fusilli, your mustards. And this is a really warm time of year. So as long as there's soil moisture, those things really grow quickly. Everybody's looking at this and going, you're completely bonkers. You're wasting a whole load of valuable seed there and time, blah, 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 blah. This organization that I work for part-time on it for a year actually went and looked at soil health, and they used aggregate stability, which is a really good overarching measure of soil health. And they saw a statistically significant improvement in soil aggregation and therefore soil health by a cover crop that's in the ground for only, say, 6 weeks to 2 months. So for me, in the vegetable space, it's literally, unless you're harvesting something and then immediately going to replant a crop, if there's going to be a month space, you want to put a cover crop in there, something cheap and really quick growing. But also in the vegetable rotations now, it's kind of going back to this whole intercropping. It's okay, we want to grow a paddock of lettuce here. you know, how can I intercrop this? What kind of service crop could I put into this? You know, and it's maybe you need to plant the lettuces as transplants and then still wait another 4 weeks before you drill something between the rows. You know, question is what? But to me, also with the intercropping going into the kind of agroecology space and the redesign of the farm system, I'm starting to go, okay, what can we also put in as intercrops that's going to help with pest and disease management, particularly pests, by providing habitat and floral resources for beneficial insects to control pests. So a good example for me here is in the arable space. You know, there's all this work being done about growing flowering strips down the side of big paddocks. I'm kind of going, why aren't we just putting something like Phacelia or buckwheat at very low density through the paddock? And then the pollinators are everywhere. And sorry, the pollinators, the beneficial insects for controlling the aphids everywhere. So a big part of this for me is reconceptualizing it. So yeah, my ideal rotation is not necessarily what's right there, but yeah, cover crops basically, whenever you have spare space, put something in to cover the ground. Mare's tail, I thought we'd already done mare's tail. No?
That was just a
Just
repeat.
about out of time. How's that? Perfect.
Merf, there's just, if you have time, there are 3 more questions in the chat. My mouse has stopped working, so you might have to
Okay, hang on.
go into the chat and check them.
There's always somebody that puts the questions in the chat. Okay, one question I have generally with flaming or any kind of heat applied to the soil is the insects being killed in the process. Where I work, we try to attract insect beneficial, so I feel these methods would affect this. Generally, if you're flame weeding, you've cultivated the ground for a direct sown high value crop like onions and carrots and parsnips and that kind of stuff. There's very, very little insect life sitting on the surface of that soil that's going to be negatively impacted by the flame weeder. If you're doing flame, well, even if you're really overcooking flame weeding, you can put your hand on the ground immediately, on the soil immediately after the flame weeder has passed, and it will be nicely warm. Not quite so much in the UK, but if you can think back to a really hot, dry summer, if you have that bare soil and you try in the middle of the day and you try to wander out in your bare feet, you'll probably burn your feet. You know, so the heating from direct heating from the sun on bare soil is going to be killing far more insects and stuff than a single pass of a flame weeder. So yeah, it's that direct negative impacts. There are a few. Look, and if a carabid beetle is unfortunately wandering over your bed and you flame over the top of it, you'll kill it. But there'll be very few there in the first place. And also, if you're attracting those beneficials around, they're all going to be sitting on the plant. There's very, very little for them on bare ground where you are flaming. How about areas of worse weeds such as couch grass? I've got patches. Again, couch grass twitch is mostly vegetatively spent, so I tend to have this kind of concept of zero tolerance, and particularly for Californian thistle. Very few Californian thistle patches originated from seed. I've seen a few handfuls of Californian thistle seedlings on farms in my entire career. So the problem is all that vegetative propagation. It's basically just eliminate the damn stuff, you know. Go in there with cultivation and doing fallows, you know, that's really bad for the soil. You know, we really need to move away from the whole concept of bare soil fallowing, but using those service crops, the smother crops, and a bit of cultivation to start, a bit of steel, smash the weeds up, and then just smother them out with something. Red clover, I saw a lot of stuff in Ireland. Red clover is really aggressive. And I've seen it wipe out, you know, it's sown with the likes of ryegrass in pastures and it just completely wipes it out. It's so competitive, particularly in low nitrogen. So putting those patches down to red clover for a year or two could be really good. And managing bindweed in cultivated soil. Is that the annual bindweed or the perennial? If it's the perennial one, as I've already said, it's just a complete nightmare. If it's your annual bindweeds, again, it's kind of all this stuff that applies for any annual weed. Get it when it's small. And the time weeders, I've just seen a YouTube video of somebody raking cleavers, goosegrass, out of a wheat crop with a time weeder. So actually, this is one of the great ironies in this space. That 80-odd page report on row hose, I found by far the best source of information was YouTube. It's slightly crazy. The scientific literature is actually really rubbish in this space. The guy's just written a paper saying, stop wasting your time on mechanical weeding research unless it's got a theoretical underpinning. most of the research is actually a complete waste of time. The best place is basically YouTube, where there's farmers and the machinery companies themselves really getting down and dirty about how they use machines and how they're working and all the rest of it. So hit YouTube. There we go.
Wow, thank you so much, so much for that, Merf. Yeah, like I said, my mouse has stopped working, so I can't undo my camera. But that was really brilliant. It was such a huge, useful resource for us. I will put this on our YouTube, as I said. And yeah, just seen by the number of questions, I think everyone really enjoyed it and was really interested. So really appreciative to you for giving up your time for this. And yeah, to everyone who came and spent their evening listening to all of this, thank you. Good luck with all the weeding for the year, and maybe see some of you at Oxford. Yeah, any final words, Merf?
No, that's it. I think I'm out of voice.
You're out of words. Great. Well, I hope the rain, the rain stops over there.
Very good. Have a good evening, everybody. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Right.